أهلا ومرحبا بكم في برنامج داخل واشنطن. أنا مضيفكم روبرت ساتلوف. إن القطار الأفغاني هو استعارة مثالية للسياسة الأمريكية في عام 2024، فقد كان الأشخاص الرئيسيون مثل جو بايدن ورون ديسانتيس في واد سائد ثم هبطوا، وكبار الأشخاص مثل إيلون ماسك ومخطط مشروع 2025 قد هبطوا ثم صعدوا. وخلال كل ذلك كان هناك شخص واحد ثابت، الشخص الذي يهيمن على السياسة الأمريكية والذي أعاد تشكيل الحزب الجمهوري على صورته، دونالد ترامب. سيكون من الصعب العثور على شخص كان قد توقع في عام 2024 أن رئيسا مسنا يترشح لولاية ثانية سيترك السباق قبل 4 أشهر فقط من الانتخابات، وأن نائبته وهي امرأة سوداء ستترشح مكانه، وأنها ستخسر كل ولاية متنازعة عليها، وستخسر التصويت الشعبي لأول مرة في الذاكرة الحديثة. والفائز الرجل الذي تغلب على المرأة الأخرى الوحيدة التي ترشحت لمنصب رئيس حزب سياسي كبير سيكون دونالد ترامب. كيف حدث ذلك؟ وهل كان ينبغي أن يشكل كل هذا مفاجأة؟ لمناقشة السياسة المجنونة لعام الذي أنقذ 2024 يسعدني أن أرحب باللجنة من الخبراء السياسيين أليكس ايزنشتات وأنجيلا جرايلين كين وجيم أنتل. So welcome back to Dakhel, Washington. This week on our show, we're going to take a look back at 2024, a year of highs and lows, a year of unexpected news, a year that we didn't anticipate. And I'm delighted to have Anjela Greiling-Keene and Jim Antle to help us go through memory lane. All right, let's begin. Let's take a step back. When the year began, just 12 months ago, what was the conventional wisdom then about the 2024 presidential election? Angela.
Well, we'll start with the fact that the conventional wisdom included Joe Biden running again for a second term. That, of course, changed. But at the beginning of the year, there were some concerns, some whispers about him being too old, potentially not fit for a second term. But it wasn't an opinion that was solidified among Democrats until the disastrous debate in late June. So that was a big change throughout the year. There also was a sense that Trump was probably less popular than what we clearly saw in the election results in November. So that was a surprise, a change as the year went along. We didn't have Elon Musk in the headlines. That was certainly a change that we saw during the year. And of course, a lot of things in Congress as the year started coming up a year ago. The Democrats were optimistic about potentially taking control of both chambers. They got neither. That was a disappointment to them and something that they'll reflect upon in the coming year. But those were a few of the highlights for where we were at 1 year ago.
All right, Jim, let's take a look at a couple of these issues. How did Donald Trump, who began the year with all sorts of competitors for the Republican presidential nomination, how did he demolish them all and come out as the undisputed heavyweight champion of the Republican world?
Well, one is it looks like Florida Governor Ron DeSantis, who is considered to be the strongest of his primary opponents, had peaked well before 2024. So he had a certain appeal to a lot of Republican primary voters who maybe liked some things about Donald Trump, but wanted to move beyond some of the distractions, beyond some of the petty feuding, beyond the mean tweets, and perhaps have a more disciplined version of Trump. And there seemed to be a market for that. But as even 2023 wore on, that seemed to dissipate. And so that there really wasn't a challenger to Trump who could win over a majority of the Republican primary electorate. And Nikki Haley emerged as really his strongest challenger, not Ron DeSantis, but it was always clear that it was going to be difficult for her to win over a majority of Republicans. She was getting a lot of crossover votes. But really, a big part of it was Trump did not treat the rest of the field as if they were true, genuine opponents. He mentioned DeSantis and Haley occasionally, went after them on occasion, but generally behaved as if he was already the nominee, and critically, I think, refused to debate them, never really letting them be seen as equals to him, or even like a real genuine form of opposition to him.
And another aspect of all this, Angela, was the year began with expectations that Donald Trump's legal problems might prove to be a huge impediment to his nomination and election. But in the end, none of it mattered. How did that happen?
A couple things. One is that his legal team was fierce and largely successful. They used tactics to delay cases as much as possible. It looked like they may not be successful, that some of the cases may be in the news right around key points in the election, but they were successful in keeping those out of the front headlines. The other part is Democrats were unsuccessful in keeping the lawsuits front of mind for voters. Democrats certainly cared, but their voters weren't going to vote for Donald Trump in the first place. So that was largely irrelevant. And Republican voters apparently didn't care. There were certain segments who more likely did, women, college-educated voters, et cetera, but not enough of them put the legal troubles front of mind when they were choosing ultimately who to vote for in November.
I mean, Jim, the whole legal issue proved to be a non-issue in retrospect. Donald Trump's great success here really needs to be noted.
I think to the degree that the legal issues affected anything, it was probably a net positive for Donald Trump. I think it actually, at least among Republicans, it reinforced a lot of their support for him, their belief that he was being persecuted, and it all added up to sort of a dare, are you going to be allowed to vote for this guy? And that made them want to vote for him more. But I thought it would be a much bigger practical problem, the amount of time he might potentially have to spend in court and not on the campaign trail, the amount of money that was going to have to go to paying lawyers rather than running the campaign. I thought it was going to be a much bigger practical impediment, regardless of the impact on the voters. And that just really mostly wasn't the case. And I think the fact that the only one of the cases that made it to trial before the election was the most convoluted of those cases and brought by someone who was most easily framed by Trump supporters as a partisan figure, really helped. Whereas maybe if, say, classified documents or something like that had gone to trial by the election, it could have been a much bigger problem.
You're referring to the New York State case about Trump money, the hush money, et cetera. Yes. So, Angela, in your opening remark, you referred to the whispers early in 2024 about Joe Biden, but it never really gaining ground. Was there ever a moment when it might have gone in another direction? And if it had early in the year, do you think it would have had an impact in the outcome of our vote in November?
I think among Democrats, there was probably some hope that Joe Biden would step aside on his own. And so people waited a long time for that to potentially happen. It's no secret how old he is. That's established fact. He's well aware of that. But Clearly, he was interested in a second term. The people closest to him were interested in him serving a second term. And in that tight bubble, they also thought that he was capable of serving a second term despite his quite evidently advancing age. And they, by all accounts, supported that. They weren't telling him to step aside until Nancy Pelosi very clearly and publicly did tell him to step aside. So that rift is probably unrepairable at this point. In terms of had he stepped aside sooner, could Democrats have won? Maybe. There of course would have been more time. One of the things that Democrats were upset about, and they talked a lot about in polls and social media and so forth, was they felt like they weren't given a choice in who to have as their nominee. They felt like Kamala Harris was foisted upon them, even though she was already the elected and sitting vice president. They felt like there should have been more of a process, and Republicans, of course, exploited that feeling, talked about it, talked about how it was unfair. The process was legally followed. That's not in question, but it did become part of the conversation. And had there been a process to select a different candidate earlier in the year, those concerns and distractions may have been minimized.
Interesting. Jim, let me turn this around and ask you sort of the inverse question, which is, was there a Democratic candidate that you think Donald Trump feared that might have emerged if Joe Biden had pulled out earlier? In the end, of course, this is a counterfactual, as they say. But is there somebody that he might have worried about a lot more than Kamala Harris proved to be?
Well, I think if they were going to replace Biden, as they did, that they needed really to replace the whole ticket. I think that the main advantage you get by making the replacement is that you don't have to defend the Biden-Harris record, which was not an advantage that Harris was going to have. So if you could have had a pair of Rust Belt governors, some combination of Gretchen Whitmer and Josh Shapiro, perhaps, as the Democratic ticket, I couldn't guarantee to you that the outcome would have been different, but it's pretty easy to see how it might have played out much differently. Democrats made the strategic decision once Joe Biden decided he was going to run for re-election that it was better to circle the wagons around him, avoid a genuinely competitive primary process. Past history had seen examples where, you get a primary challenger, they do well enough to weaken the incumbent further for the general election, but they don't actually defeat the incumbent. So I think the fear was that if you had a Gavin Newsom or somebody like that actually get in, Biden might still be the nominee, but he'd be even weaker against Donald Trump in the general election. So they wanted to avoid that. And then after the debate, I think there was a lot of appetite for a do-over on that decision. But, there wasn't really any competitive process by which, because the primaries were over, so they would have had to have invented a competitive process. And I think by the time they finally pushed Biden out, there just wasn't really the appetite to go through it again with Harris. And there were a lot of practical reasons why it seemed just easier to ride with Vice President Harris. But in retrospect, it didn't work.
We're joined by Alex Eisenstadt. Alex, glad to have you with us. We can't overlook one other key issue that occurred, especially in the summer of 2024, the story of political violence in our electoral system, at least 2 assassination attempts on Donald Trump. What impact did this have on our politics, Alex?
Well, it really blew a hole into this notion that somehow we are now safe from the notion of political violence or political assassinations. I mean, you've seen a rise of this you saw it happen on January 6th, you saw political violence. And then you saw during this election, you saw that it really continued on. And so now what you have is you have extreme security around different candidates. You see security as nominees are walking through the halls of Congress. And so the notion of political violence, that it's returned, that it's a threat to politicians, it's really intensified at this point.
And did it have, Angela, when you look back, did it have any political impact in the summer of 2024?
Oh yeah, so much political impact. The day of the shooting at the Trump rally in Pennsylvania, we immediately saw an AP photograph become iconic. Just right out of the gate, it was used for Trump memes. It was used for Trump merchandising. It motivated voters. Him pumping his fist in the air, with blood on his ear. So of course that had political implications. There was no such iconic image on the Democratic side, and the shooting itself, in addition to the imagery, was used to propel voters out of anger. Their candidate was shot at. That's terrible. So it was a great way to motivate voters to turn out, to show up, to be present. And of course, when there was the second would-be assassination attempt in Florida, that added fuel to the fire.
And Jim, any lingering implications of these episodes in our politics today?
Well, one, I think the assassination attempt in which Trump was actually shot, and you had that imagery, it strengthened an already fairly strong bond between Trump and his hardest core supporters. And I think there's also been, it opened up a lot of issues about the Secret Service and how well run the Secret Service is and how well funded it is and whether it's being spread too thin and whether its leadership team is the correct leadership team. And there has been a lot of bipartisan congressional scrutiny of the Secret Service since particularly the Butler assassination attempt. And I suspect some of that's going to continue in the next Congress.
All right. When we come back after the break, we're going to pick up with that last word Jim mentioned, namely Congress, and the important changes that we saw on Capitol Hill over the last 12 months and their implications for the months ahead in just a moment. Guests on this show include Alex Eisenstadt. Alex is a politics reporter for Politico, an online platform that is all politics all the time. He spent this election season closely covering the Trump campaign. And with us is Angela Greiling-Keane. Angela is the news director at Bloomberg Government and the Journalism and Women's Symposium president. Also with us on today's show is James Antle. Jim is the executive editor of Washington Examiner magazine. Previously, he was the politics editor at the Examiner. Congress was a big issue in 2024. Remember a guy named Kevin McCarthy? Why was leadership so difficult to maintain a year ago? And why has it been so straightforward, it seems, for the new leader to keep it? Alex Eisenstadt, let me start with you.
So part of this has to do with the peculiarities of the dynamics around Kevin McCarthy, which is he just had he had several really prominent enemies within the Republican conference, namely Matt Gaetz. You had other people around Matt Gaetz who were willing to go to war with Kevin McCarthy, and Mike Johnson just doesn't elicit the same level of animosity towards himself from a lot of his colleagues. Mike Johnson's also had the steadfast support of Donald Trump, and that's really helped as well.
And when you look at the other side of the aisle, the Democrats over the last year, what do you see, Angela?
Well, we of course saw a transition of Democratic leadership in the House with Hakeem Jeffries as the minority leader. He had hoped to be the incoming House Speaker next year. That's not happening. but all expectations are that he's keeping the leadership role for the foreseeable future. Even though he failed at taking over control of the House, Democrats did not eat their own, as Republicans have proven more likely to do with their leadership choices in recent years. We still see Chuck Schumer in his leadership position in the Senate. As much congressional leadership for the incoming Congress is shifting to younger, newer faces, the Senate Democrats did not choose to make a change there. So as Democrats reflect on their failures at the ballot box in November, it is interesting that they're sticking with Schumer, not throwing him under the bus. But we certainly have seen an evolution in Democratic leadership in Congress, but not a sea change.
And Jim, Donald Trump won very convincingly in his vote, but House Republicans is basically a wash. Very narrow majority going into the election, even slightly narrower majority coming out of the election. Seems disappointing, isn't it?
Yes, and it's a second election cycle in a row where I think Republicans have been disappointed, although, I think that they were probably more optimistic in 2022 than they were this time around. I think some of it has to do with there are certain inefficiencies. It's sort of a bizarro world version of 2016, where your Democrats win the popular vote, but didn't win it in the right places to win the electoral college majority. In the last two cycles, Republicans have actually won the popular vote for the House, but not really in areas that maximize their chances to pick up seats. And there were also some very good Democratic candidates in some competitive districts who did well, minimized Republican gains, kind of made it a wash. And we may now, through redistricting and other factors, at least for the foreseeable future, be a little bit wave-proof. We've had a number of blue waves and red waves, and much of the low-hanging fruit really for both parties has already been picked in cycles like 2006, 2010. And so Republicans and Democrats are really fighting over a very small number of seats.
Interesting. All right, let's go abroad for a couple of minutes in this review of the past year. Angela, when you think back to 2024, what was the number one international story of the year?
The number one story of 2024 is clearly the Middle East. We have the still ongoing and no end in sight conflict between Israel and Gaza, Palestinians overall. That has been the international story. It's very much affected the U.S. It played a part in the U.S. election. It has consumed attention from politicians at all levels and may have played a big role in costing Democrats control of the Congress and the White House.
Interesting. Jim, do you think that was the top international story of the year?
Yes, absolutely. What's going on in the Middle East, from Gaza to the collapse of the Assad regime just this month, is huge. And what the Middle East is going to look like in the coming years is a really open question. But I also think Russia, the war in Ukraine, Russia's invasion of Ukraine, that still looms pretty large. And the potential, depending on how the escalation goes, how the upcoming peace talks, if there are peace talks, I think the Trump administration is going to try to push them to the negotiating table. How those things go, that could potentially become an even bigger issue than what's going on in the Middle East right now.
Thank you all, Alex Eisenstadt, Angela Greiling-Keane, and Jim Antle, for joining me this week on Dakhel, Washington. وبهذا تنتهي هذه الحلقة من برنامج داخل واشنطن. إذا كانت لديكم أسئلة أو تعليقات حول هذه الحلقة، خاصة حول أهم الأحداث لعام 2024، أرجو التواصل معي عبر تويتر على هاشتاج Inside Washington أو مباشرة @RobSatloff. وحتى أراكم في الأسبوع المقبل، شكرا لكم وإلى اللقاء.